Last night at the burger joint.
This story took place in one of the towns in our states. It happened to a guy named Dan and a strange guy who had a strange name. His name was Beam. At 22 years old, Dan already felt like a failure. He dropped out of college after his sophomore year, unable to keep up with his course load. His student loans were piling up. Letters from the bank with threatening red stamps, urgent notice, were increasingly left unopened on the table in his cheap apartment. A job. He needed a job. He started looking for a job to earn some money. Harry's Burger was his last option. It's a diner on the outskirts of Chicago, in the very neighborhood where even the streetlights flickered with hesitation, as if afraid to illuminate what was happening in the shadows. The interior, sticky tables, shabby menus, the faint odor of spoiled butter embedded in the walls. However, they paid cash. All they asked for when hiring was a name and insurance. That said, night shifts meant fewer people, less shame. Dan thought it was just temporary, until he met Beam. He was working in the kitchen, tall, but somehow improperly tall, as if his spine stretched slightly as he moved. His skin was pale, almost gray. You'd think he hadn't seen the sun in years, and his movements were too fluid, not human. When Bim cut onions, his fingers curved at unnatural angles. From a distance, it looked as if his joints under the skin could move anywhere. When he turned cutlets, his wrist turned a full turn without the slightest tension. And his eyes, they were glass. They didn't reflect light, didn't change expression, just fixed. Every time a customer walked into Harry's Burger, Bim would freeze for a second, his pupils dilating. His lips would stretch slightly, resembling a smile, but it wasn't a smile. It was that strange resemblance of a smile. However, the scariest part was the way he looked at the meat. He didn't look like a chef, but somehow different, evaluative, professional, and not like a hungry man. He looked hungry, impatient. You'd think he was admiring it. When Bim unwrapped the packages of frozen cutlets, his fingers trembled slightly. He ran his palm over them as if he were stroking live flesh, not a half-finished product. Sometimes he brought a piece to his face and inhaled its scent. At that moment, his pupils narrowed into black dots, and his tongue slid slowly across his thin lips. One day, Dan noticed Bim sniffing the raw cutlet with his eyes closed, as if enjoying the aroma of expensive wine. "Are you all right?" Dan asked uncertainly. Bim slowly turned his head. "It's okay," he answered, and his voice sounded too deep, too wet. "I just love my job." Dan didn't ask again. One day Dan came to work in high spirits. That night, a huge full moon shone outside the window. It was a dark red color. All the day shift workers had already gone home, and Dan realized it was just him and Beam. The Harry Burger was empty that fateful night. Only a few cars passed on the highway. "You're jumpy today," Bim said suddenly, still cutting up the cutlets. His voice sounded like he had a lot of saliva in his mouth. "Just tired," Dan replied, feeling a chill run down his spine. Later, when Dan went to take out the trash, he noticed that Bim had disappeared somewhere. He saw that the door to the warehouse was ajar. Curiosity overcame fear, and he looked inside. There, in the dim light of the lamp, Bim was standing over something. No, not something. Over someone. There was a dead vagrant lying on the floor. It was the tramp Dan had seen a couple of hours ago at the dumpsters. Bim was methodically cutting him up like meat, carefully placing the pieces into black bags. Dan looked away, distracted for a moment. At the same moment he heard, "You're not going to tell, are you?" Beam's voice came from just behind Dan's back. He turned around and saw his mouth, wide, too wide, full of sharp, thin teeth. Dan rushed for the exit, but the door was locked. Bim followed him leisurely, his fingers stretching out like tentacles. "We all eat meat here. It's just that we all have a different taste." "Different tastes," he hissed. The last thing Dan saw before the darkness engulfed him was Beam's open mouth. The next morning, one of the visitors to Harry's Burger found a note on the table, the recipe for the signature burger, fresh meat, spices, and a dash of fear. And there was fresh meat in the refrigerator.